But I wanted Stephen to introduce you, and let's just start that, and Benedict, please start the recording.
Yes,
and then after this introduction, please Benedict, put everybody into breakout rooms in groups of 3 per room.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, great. Thank you, Peter. It's an absolute delight to have Peter Layden with us this morning. I have to note that we owe John Cale, who we will hear from tomorrow, a note of thanks for making the connection and an endorsement to Peter to work with us. So thank you to John. But Peter is truly a world-renowned, world-leading futurist who in the late 1990s served as managing editor of the legendary Wired magazine. In August 2012, he founded reInvent, a San Francisco-based community that creates conversations with remarkable thought leaders and elite gatherings of innovators from diverse fields. Their website at reinvent.net features full-length videos of more than 100 events focused on how innovators worldwide are working to solve big challenges and more fundamentally reinvent our world. So as Peter and I actually discovered the other day, in February 2021, Peter joined Autodesk part-time as the Senior Director of Strategic Foresight. It actually grew out of a collaboration we had over the summer that kind of unbeknownst to the time, but our friend John Pittman from Autodesk was the connection there. But Peter holds master's degrees from Columbia University in comparative politics and in journalism, and also an undergraduate degree from Georgetown University, my alma mater actually, in intellectual history. Which I don't think was offered when I was there, but Peter, I think that's a really cool undergraduate degree to have. So thank you so much for joining our program for the first time. And let me turn it over to you to kind of set the stage for the video and maybe some of the discussion we should have following it.
Okay, well, they didn't have the intellectual history at the time, but I invented it basically. I literally took advantage of the way I could design my own major and did that, which is kind of a theme here around innovation. So just to kind of put it in context and get you to the video. So I did come out here to the very early Wired magazine. I was not a founder, but I was an early player in that game. Later rose to run it in that first iteration of Wired. But it kind of makes sense here to kind of your thing. So for the last 25 years, I've been plugged into many of the leading kind of technology folks, entrepreneurs, innovators in the Bay Area, and have continued to do that through a succession of other companies and startups. And the latest one he mentioned, reInvent, actually just did not make it through the pandemic. Actually, it was actually an 8-year run, and we had to wind it down, honestly, because we were so rooted in physical events and things. But that's innovation, you know. And I've had another startup, and anyhow, we've done a bunch of things out here around this. But I think for what's interesting to you is I've been plugged into the broader sense, the technology innovation community for the last 25 years here. And I've also spent a lot of time in future-oriented kind of companies or future-oriented kind of orientation to what's going on. And now what happened in this talk you're going to see here is with the Long Now Foundation, which if you don't know it, it's essentially was founded by Stuart Brand, who's kind of a legendary figure out here in the Bay Area, but also in America. He's kind of an American original. If you don't know him, tune into this guy. He's been a serial innovator across so many things. Anyhow, this the Long Now Foundation is really trying to get people to think really long term. I mean, they're building essentially a 10,000-year clock that's going to last for 10,000 years in the deserts of Texas. Jeff Bezos funding that one. Anyhow, and they have a seminar series there where every month they take someone who's been thinking deeply about the future and to essentially do a new lecture. And this is a new lecture that I worked up off a body of work I've been working on for the last year and a half, called The Transformation. I had originally, back in the Wired days, had done a famous cover story and a book with Peter Schwartz, who is kind of a pioneering scenario planner. I had basically done a book called The Long Boom, which had started from the mid-90s and looked ahead till 2020, kind of breathing life into what the globalized digital economy was going to look like. Largely played out, by the way. And it's at that cusp period, 2020, I started, or previous to it, I started another project that was looking out to 2050. So what I'm looking at is the next 30 years in this talk, condensing it down and driving it down to a bunch of ways to think about it. you're right. It's a very broad context here, but I will point out two things here. There is a very much a look at innovation there, and I am predicting through this thing, which I lay out in this piece, you'll see this. We're going into a period of accelerated innovation, and there's a bunch of reasons for that. You can kind of look at that, and we should talk about that. But also, there's incredible opportunities out there in which I talk about a triple whammy long boom, not just a one digital technology long boom, but three fundamentally world historical technologies that are rolling out in this next 30 years. And you folks, if you're taking your masters right now, you're walking into an era of more opportunity, I think, than we've even seen in the last era that we've just been through. So with that, I think I'll leave it to you, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end. There's a ton more to go talk about there. It's really a full hour keynote, but for this, you get the 30-minute best stuff. So enjoy it.
So,
Is that helpful?
Yeah, that's very helpful. So you know what? I just changed my mind. I think that because a lot of people have not had the time to see it. I understand.
I think we should show the video.
Yeah, we will show the 33-minute video right now for everyone. And for those who knows it very well, okay, you can come back in 33 minutes. But let's show the video, and the quality is not so good, perhaps. So what do you think? Should we ask people just to click on the video themselves? That would give the best quality instead of Bendik driving that from his own machine.
I think it would. My feeling is it would probably work fine if you just streamed it into the thing. I mean, I'm often on Zoom things that do that. Is he coming off? Yeah. But it's up to you guys, however you want to do it.
Yep. So I think that we will ask each and every one of you to use click on the link that I just emailed you with the video. That gives you the best quality. And we will be back at 1:15. And then we go into the breakout rooms, say for about 15 minutes from 1:15 and then we engage you in a Q&A, Peter. I think that's probably a better plan.
So what time do you want Peter to be back for the Q&A discussion?
In 33 minutes, when the video is over, over 1:15.
Okay, great. Sounds like a good plan. Looking forward to seeing you folks at the other end of this.
Yeah, so in 35 minutes, we're back, okay?
All right.
Okay.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Peter, I think it's a very impressive video and very interesting content that you have created. I think this is the 4th time I see it in just a few days. It's very interesting, and I so much enjoy your positive view that you also share in this video. When you read papers or listening to the news, it's it's like a dark cloud all over us. And in Norway, in this pandemic thing, they're moving. The solutions will come, but in 3 months, in 4 and 5, and we're so slow with this vaccine and so on. Anyway, but let's not talk about that too much. I enjoy your positive spin and your constructive speculations, if I may use a term like that. So, and I was thinking of having people go into breakout rooms, but you know what? Now that we have you here, I think we will just start a Q&A now and go on till 6 if we can. So I ask everybody just to start preparing your questions and send them in via the chat, please. This raising of hands and so, it doesn't really work when it's more than 20 people on Zoom, because I don't see everybody at the same time. So let's use the chat. So and I'll soon open it up. But tell us first, Peter, a little more about the work that lies behind this video, and also the work that lies behind your own thinking here.
You mean this project? Okay, so, well, maybe I'll say it this way. It's like, I'm kind of an indefatigable optimist. I'm just kind of wired that way. So one way to think about it is that's kind of how I am. But that said, I've been out here, like I say, in the Bay Area for 25 years, and if you folks were here, I mean, I know that's a big part of this week for you normally in your projects here, and there's something about just being out here that it's just essentially a collection of can-do optimists. I mean, you have to be an optimist to kind of start up, do this. I've done several. I've done about 4 of my own kind of startups. You just have to have a kind of optimism, because it's everything. You're against everything, and you have to basically, you're innovating on the fly, and every morning there's a new crisis you got to figure out. And anyhow, so but this is like, imagine a community that's just kind of jam-packed with people like that. And what's also so that's kind of the milieu I've been in for the last 25 years. It's also, what's interesting about Silicon Valley and the Bay Area is it's really kind of a polyglot of people from all over the world, and tons of people from Scandinavia always here, but also all over the world. You got Russians, you got Chinese, you got Indians. I mean, the whole thing. And so there's a kind of this global can-do crew that reinforces it. And then the other thing which is interesting about the Bay Area, which has to do with innovation, by the way, is it's a very it's not just about technology. People think, oh, it's Silicon Valley, it's just technology. No, it's a huge biotech place now. It's a huge thing around energy. It's sitting in California, which, by the way, again, this is another thing. When I say the Bay Area, it's really the Bay Area. The other way you could talk about this is California. I mean, California is the 5th largest economy in the world. I mean, it's kind of its own little nation state. It's kind of setting extremely progressive and ambitious kind of rules on climate and all kinds of stuff. And so you're in this environment where it's easier to be optimistic. Let me just put it that way. And it's sunny, and it's it's not snowing, and anyhow all this stuff that goes with that. So it's a kind of interesting environment. But I don't want to be facetious about it, but it's more this other thing. And I think when you guys talk about innovation, I know that's the focus of this crew and your work and everything else is. I mentioned it in this piece as well, or this talk. To me, that is a central piece of innovation, is the cross-fertilization of many different ideas and the mosh pit of kind of different perspectives, and how you just fit those pieces together and how many different ways it can happen. And boom, something works unknown, it's seen, and boom. So again, you can imagine if you create a meta environment of that, or a mega environment of just literally 8 million people jammed together in the Bay Area here, kind of with, largely that mentality, not everybody, but many of them. A lot of stuff happens, and it's an exciting place to be in. Because of that, you kind of feel more optimistic about things in general, and that's the way I would explain that one.
Yeah, and that's interesting. So Norway has, Norway is in a transformation in the sense that they have been, our economy has been relying on the oil, and fossil fuels are getting less and less valuable, and we need to make a huge transition. So I think that some of the ideas and tools are very interesting. So before I invite the participants to ask you questions, Stephen, can I ask you, so you spoke about earlier, Stephen, the state of innovation in the United States earlier today. So what stands out from Peter Layden's talk to you?
Well, one implicit thing I think is it's the power of ICT across sectors that is driving a lot of this transformation. So Peter mentioned CRISPR and gene editing. That's bringing the information technology revolution to biotechnology. A lot of that is the same with the energy as well. And now biotech is going to solve the energy with the clean meats, right? So the convergence of these technologies, and actually ICT being a platform. Peter said, well, the biotech took a little bit longer. Well, I think that's because the ICT ecosystem had to get to a point where it could enable that biotech transformation. And then you see the same thing now in clean energy. I noticed that in the prior book, Peter, you of course talked about going to Mars. To me, one of the big things as well is going to be, can we really make some breakthrough in propulsion technologies? Because if we can figure out hypersonics, new forms of transportation, that could, open up to the next, layer of the transformation.
Should I respond to that? Because I have a thought
Sure.
about that. So one of the things that maybe wasn't clear in this talk, which, by the way, I encourage anyone to do, is there's another written manifestation of this work, and it's called The Transformation. It's a 6-part series in Medium, open to anyone, in which I can send the link, or you guys can figure out the link. It's literally called, the series is called the Transformation, and that is a different way at this material. It's essentially a story told by someone in 2100, which is a Gen Z. This is another thing. It's a Gen Z kid, who's born in 2000, who comes of age in 2020 here as coming out of college. But that whole generation is going to live the entire century, right? I mean, they're basically, the lifespans are almost certainly going to go 100 years, and if not more. And so the people, they're going to basically, the next 80 years are going to be their lifetime. And so what's interesting is then you think, well, what would someone in 2100 looking back on this kind of 30-year period, how would they tell a story? And what that 6-part series is, one is the introduction in my voice, but then the next 5 stories is told in the voice of this person in the future. And I do encourage you to do it, because it literally layers a lot more detail into how does this stuff happen and what are the policies, and literally all the politics and how it plays out. I mean, it's an ambitious thing. It's kind of like a small book. It's not quite book scale yet, but that's the next. I think I'm going to do a book on this. Anyhow, the point is, the reason I'm kind of saying that is when you take the lens from that, to me, I thought a lot about in this period, what is going to be the impact of space technologies, quantum computing, fusion energy in terms of energy from the kind of the clean, essentially nuclear energy. And my research on this, which I told you saw in there, is about 25 world-class experts, as well as all kinds of other people and all the work I've been doing for years here, is I actually feel those 3, space, quantum, and fusion, if we even get there, although it's looking likely like we are, would probably make its biggest impact in the next half of the century. So weirdly, it's like when you really take a big view, it's like, will it really hit this next 30 years? I mean, I think space, to a certain extent, we're going to get a lot of decent traction there. But I actually think the full impact is going to be in the second half of the century. But again, since you're talking to, some of you folks in the audience here are, young people, I'm not going to see that era, but you will. And so the thing is, just take, it's all going to keep rolling, but, and it's going to be that'll be an amazing year too. But I actually don't think we're gonna get there. I don't think we're going to quite get to asteroid mining and a bunch of stuff that people think about. Eventually we will as humans, but I think it'll be latter part of the century and maybe even the next century. But anyhow, the point is, yes, there's so many other exciting things that I didn't touch on in this talk, let alone even in the written piece. But that just shows you the cornucopia of opportunities we have out there, because certainly the early science on all that stuff has to happen, and there's going to be plenty of interesting things there. And if people really want to do that kind of work, great, go in there. But it's still going to be, it's not going to have the scalable impact on everybody on the planet in the same way that those technologies I mentioned there, which are literally going to touch everybody's lives in the next 30 years.
So, very fantastic. So let us depart from there, and I'll turn it over to the participants here. So I'll ask you to say what you work with or what you're interested in when it regards innovation or digital technologies when you pose your question. So I'll just start with the first in the chat room here. So Morten, it's your turn. Morten,
hi, my name is Morten. I work with e-health in the public sector. It's great video, and for us, kind of has been fed with Donald Trump and the last 8 years, and hasn't kind of lost the faith of US. It's great to have some positive perspective and gain some faith again. But I just and I love the video, and I totally agree. But I can see kind of a shift regarding women, and especially in the Democratic Party, and I think women will become a major driver for change and driver in this transformation, and you'll reach a tipping point. You have Kamala Harris, and you have Ocasio-Cortez, and also you have the Whitney Wolf, the CEO of Bumble. So just want to hear your thoughts about that.
Totally right. Again, the unfortunate thing about someone who's, when you're writing anything or even doing a 30-minute talk, I mean, you think, okay, 30 minutes, that's a lot of time. Honestly, I pretty much taped about an hour's worth of work, which we just had to edit down just because people won't listen to it. Keynote. I did it for 20 years. I've been doing keynotes, and weirdly on a stage, you can go for 50 minutes, run around the stage with your slides going on big screens, and it's fine. You can't, it's just, I guess, Zoom fatigue, whatever the hell it is. But you got to, it just doesn't work in that same scale. So anyhow, the point being is there's a lot of material that was literally left on the cutting room floor on this talk, but is still, I could talk about. One of them is, and I had to make a choice around this, is I think one of the inexorables is, I call it, again, I'm trying to get two-word things, but women equalize. I think as a global phenomenon, actually, I would even go further, which is, I think what you're going to see here, and it's essentially a secondary effect of urbanization and education and all these factors. Essentially, we've watched how it worked in the West and developed countries, but we can see it in the developing world too, how that works, is the rise of women. And in terms of equalizing their relations and the larger impact on all kinds of things, on family, on children, on health, on savings, on, just doing the right thing. I mean, it's a million ways. You can see this just at the very visceral level of when women essentially are empowered, essentially it's good for everybody. And in global context, it's definitely playing out. I also see it in a more advanced stage in the developed countries. I mean, Europeans and particularly the Nordic countries, you guys are ahead of the US in that respect when it comes to women in positions of power. I don't know exactly, but maybe it's not as much, but it seems like Scandinavian countries are ahead of the US. But I think that's absolutely happening. And I think it's also a generational thing. I think what's interesting, and again, I'm trying to always apply a big picture lens on what's happening here, which is, if you really want to think in world historical terms, what happened in the baby boom, essentially the last 40 years, is essentially, you can say almost the biggest accomplishment of the baby boomers, both in America, but also in Europe, is essentially equalizing the sexes to the point where it's maybe not perfect and there's all these issues around it and super high leadership, but in general, compared to every single previous historical era and every culture in the history of the planet, pretty much, with maybe a few exceptions, this is the first time we really watched that transition happen, both in terms of relationships, but also in terms of power and in the economy and working and all kinds of stuff. Now, it's not perfect by any means, but it's a huge shift from world historical perspective. That thing is going to happen all over the planet in this next 30 years too. And one of the secondary effects of that is the millennial generation coming after, and then the Gen Zers coming off of the boomers who went through that very painful process. I'm a late end boomer myself. And it was a hard transition. But my daughter, who's a millennial, is like, they don't even like think twice about the equality of sex. And so they're starting from a baseline that's different. And so I think the leadership of women, I think the impact of women will be much more profound in this next generation and the generations after. And I think then we're in a kind of equal playing field for as long as we can think. But anyhow, I think so. So again, a bigger lens on the situation is that is a meta thing, and that is a good thing, and that is we're already starting to see the beginnings of that. It's only going to get more and better, and pretty soon it'll be kind of ridiculous. We'll look back in 2100 and say, "Do you remember when women couldn't like run anyhow? They had to stay at home all the time. That was what a crazy thing." Anyhow, that's kind of where we're at. If that's helpful. Good point. It's just and it's a big deal.
Vladislav, it's your turn, please.
Thanks, Pedrinho. First, I wanted to thank you all for the very inspiring and exciting day and exciting talk, Peter. I have a question for you regarding governments, because in your talk, you are talking about how important governments are. And as we learned today from several speakers, China is in the leading pack for AI and some of the major technologies which will impact all of us in the future, but they're utilizing their closed innovation system very successfully. Example of that is the great Chinese firewall, right? So should we be worried or concerned for China's power in the future, as their political model is not exactly democracy as we know it for today?
Great question. And yeah, so here's a couple of things to think about in this. Let me break this one down. I would just say the liberal democracies of the West, including Europe and the United States and Northern Europe, Southern Europe, let's just put us, we're all in one kind of civilizational tradition, let's just say. And we are really in a bad place right now in terms of the kind of how our system is working, or frankly not working. Everyone's focusing on the not working. I'm trying to like draw out that there's a lot that is working. Let's don't throw out everything and let's start. But one of the things that is really clear is the last 40-year period, that conservative era. When I talk about the US, and we kind of had the prism because I was talking to an American audience mostly, the Reagan thing. I mean, the same thing happened in Europe. I mean, you essentially you guys went through a kind of a post-war liberal welfare statey progressive world to a kind of a market-driven neoliberal kind of conservative era. There might be a little nuances between different countries, but in general, from a big picture, that's what happened. And I think now we're entering a period where, particularly around climate change, and this kind of increasingly obvious thing that we're sitting on a kind of a small planet with 8 billion tracking to 10 billion people, we're going to have to reinvigorate government in a way just for just to get stuff done. But also, I think we're also opening up a different period of like, what is 21st century government, strong government in a kind of digital age? I mean, one of the things the conservatives were pillaring essentially in the last era was these big lumbering bureaucracies from the 20th century, that progressive era. I mean, the early progressive era of the mid-century, 20th century, those things were vital and scaling and doing great. But by the time it was the 80s, there were these lumbering bureaucracies, and that's bad. But that doesn't mean that's not government, isn't a that's a 20th century version of government. You could imagine a super efficient digital, kind of lightweight, super responsive, totally intuitive infrastructure of government, in the 21st century, which is, I'm positing that's what we're going to see. We're going to just see, essentially, we're going to reinvigorate a different set of tools around strong government in a Western liberal democracy sense, just essentially applying a lot of the same digital transformation we did to business the last 40 years, we're going to apply it to government. And anyhow, there's a way that we can do that, and we will do that, and we'll use strong government to do that. Now, what I would say, what you brought up is the counter side is like there's another civilizational essentially tradition coming out of China, and they've married a lot of the kind of Western civilization stuff of global capitalism and things like that. But in general, there's still a different organizational model they're building up. It's been very successful now because they don't have the kind of debates, and they don't have the kind of the paralyzing politics that essentially we're witnessing in the West. And so that's admirable on that level. They can just get shit done, move stuff fast, respond to the future, invest, and there's a lot of admirable stuff on that. But it also raises a lot of issues around, what kind of society you want to live in, and it's very dangerous. I used to be one of my earlier things. I mean, we didn't go into it. I started as a journalist, as a foreign correspondent in Asia. I watched the rise of China. My perch was in South Korea because I was in Seoul. There, I was a young journalist, and the top guys were in Beijing and Hong Kong, and I was with Newsweek. But I was in China in right a month after Tiananmen Square. I was actually in a jail in China. I was arrested actually in Tibet under martial law. I mean, anyhow, I've been in China and I've visited quite a bit since then. And there's a lot of issues with, you don't want to necessarily live in a totalitarian system like that. And long term, the kind of, from an innovation point of view and a kind of long-term robustness of dealing with changes, a totalitarian thing or a highly authoritarian structure is not necessarily the best long-term system, but in a short term, they're moving stuff fast. So anyhow, there's a way to think about that. I would just say we've got to revigorate, I would say, the democratic kind of tradition, and we will, is my feeling. But in that said, is you can admire a lot of what they're doing there because they're moving fast. Third thing I would say is, I don't know who you were talking to earlier, but one of the people I've gotten close to and actually interviewed for this project is Kai-Fu Lee. Maybe and his book AI Superpowers I'd highly recommend it. It's an excellent book, but he's much more, and I've had many private conversations with him, including on this this project. He sees the strengths of both systems. He literally used to work in the U.S. For all the top companies, and now he's a VC guy in China. He knows them both. And I would say the early advantage of AI does go to the Chinese because they essentially can, they don't have the same worry of data, and essentially AI is essentially a function of big data at some level at this stage. And so they're jumping right into it in a way that the West has more complicated ways to deal with that data. But again, I would say long-term innovation, the jury's out. It also, he says it flat out. I had him in an interview, I had him in a series in my What's Now San Francisco series, which I had him in a public thing, and I had a dinner afterwards with a dozen people. He said long-term, he said the West is far superior in fundamental innovation around AI. He said basically the Chinese are good at kind of secondary kind of innovation, which is essentially after the big breakthroughs that come often through the West. They're good at filling all the niches of taking that AI breakthrough and filling it in all these different kind of industries or something. And that's kind of what we're watching now. But the really big breakthroughs that'll get us to, increasingly intelligent AI and stuff like that, he does not see their way going that way. He sees them as more scaling the current breakthroughs. So there's two ways of innovation in AI. There's how do you really make the fundamental breakthroughs? Right now we're in deep learning. By the way, my sources in AI say that we cannot get to really superior, like intelligent machines in a way that we think of more independent intelligence through deep learning. It's just a dead end. And so, but there is this new sense of how do you go into the virgin turf of the real frontier of ultimate AI that'll keep going for, a century or two. That is still virgin turf, and that's all dominated by the West right now, and particularly America. Anyhow, that's maybe a long explanation there, but you had a lot. That was a loaded question.
Thanks. So thank you. So Rasmus, it's your turn, and then Karin.
But I think that I pretty much, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity, but I think I actually got the answer. That was a good long answer to Vlad, so I got mine. So please just go on to Karin. Thank you.
Okay, Karin, you're up.
Thank you. And it's I must say it's very nice to hear such an optimistic view. It's well needed, and so thank you for that. My question will be like one of the questions. Do you think that we really will be able to move fast enough? Since you're talking about the importance of politics, and the politicians really have an important role in this, and we do know that there are some strong political forces that are on the totally different way or on to totally different side of the scale, like China, Russia, Brazil, or like So my question would be like, where do you think like it will be the biggest difficulties to actually turn this around in time? Like, would it be like some part of the world, like energy supply or food supply, or an idea of like the biggest difficulties?
Good question. Here's actually where it goes. And if you read my last two pieces in this thing, just for future reference, and particularly the last piece in my series is really about the civilizational perspective. It's really trying to think about this in a civilizational thing. And that's the stuff that got cut out of the piece that you saw, which was dense enough and you know, couldn't go much further. But I actually had recorded this, and it's something I've thought a ton about, and it's related to what you're saying. Is I think we have the technologies. I think we have the capital. I think we have the human resources. I think we have the ability to innovate. By the way, the innovation thing, I would add one thing, this is related to this, which is it's not just cross-fertilization. There's a whole, our understanding of innovation has gone from an art to a science, which I can talk about that later. But that's the other thing that's happened in the last 30 years is essentially, well, actually, I'll just do it right now since I mentioned it, and I'll get to your question here. There's essentially through businesses trying to get a handle on this, and ultimately now it's academia. There's a whole world of design thinking, and I mean, I'm assuming you guys are going into lean startups and iterative kind of innovation, and all kinds of stuff, and A/B testing. And I mean, there's a million things that have come off this. But I'm just saying, compared to where we were 40 years ago, we essentially are understanding innovation much better. And we're essentially, I think the bigger way to think of it is we've gone from an art, like, these crazy people thinking about something new in a someplace, to we can actually teach it in grad school. And now we're just punching out all kinds of people of like how you accelerate innovation. And so it's now getting what's happening. We're accelerating innovation all over the place. And there's only going to get more because we're going to learn more and more and more and more. And pretty soon it's just going to be like a science. You'll get your master's in innovation in the way you get a medical degree or something. Anyhow, the point is that's a big deal, which is worth deconstructing if we want to. But the point being is that's not the problem here. I would say the problem that you're kind of pointing at, you kind of didn't say exactly, but how do we solve climate change? How do we solve these big challenges? What are the missing pieces? And I would say there's two missing pieces, which I talk about with more of a civilizational perspective long term that I think is going to happen, but it's the furthest and most complicated issues. One is I think we have to reinvent democracy, to put it in the broadest sense, which is right now in America and the West, we are trapped in a sense. The last time our representative democracies were invented in the Enlightenment. They're essentially a function of the last period of civilization building in the planet was the Enlightenment. It's about I always say it's about 1680 to 1800, but we invented financial capitalism, we invented, carbon energy extraction, industrial production, representative democracy. Anyhow, we invented kind of innovations that essentially were civilizational scale innovations that essentially were still on, and that got us into trouble. So we got really good at carbon energy extraction till we screwed the whole planet up, right? But one thing with that lens is we're all still stuck in this goofball representative democracy thing. In the US, we're like, ruled by electoral college rules that were essentially a deal cut with the slave owning states, in 1787, for God's sake. It's like, that's just nuts to kind of let your civilization be run by that. And, we're in a digital age where everything's instantaneous and 400 million Americans with, kind of instantaneous connection is like, anyhow, there's a bunch of things that from a historical point of view, they're gonna look back and go, boy, they have waited a long time to reform that freaking thing. I think that's gonna change. It's also the most difficult one is what does supersede representative democracy in a way that actually layers digital technologies and all the things we know about this into that. I think it's gonna happen. That's the hardest thing. The second hardest thing I think, and it probably won't happen in the next 30 years, although we're gonna see the beginnings of it, it'll take the century, is we have to have some kind of global governance. We have to have some kind of situation that goes beyond the current international relations again, is a function of the last era of the Enlightenment. Nation states were invented in the Enlightenment. And essentially we built a civilizational way international relations was a function of that civilization. And we're stuck because what you just said, well, Russia can do whatever it wants, or, China can do whatever. It's like, we don't have a way to coordinate it a more highly calibrated way. I'm not saying it has to be one government and some supreme leader of the whole planet. I'm not going there. But there has to be some super innovation, meta innovation to coordinate a planet that is essentially of 10 billion people that is essentially in a climate crisis and is going to get only worse. And also has, pandemics, this crazy little thing can come out of a province in China and 6 months later, the entire global economy has collapsed. It's like, okay, that's a global problem. We got to get a handle on it. Anyhow, we're just starting to see what happens in this kind of world. Well, so from a long-term perspective, those two things have to figure out. Those are the hardest problems, frankly. And it's harder to speculate on how that'll play out. But I will tell you, that's going to happen and something has to happen there. And that's even, it gets into the China thing, which is China is solving the near-term problem, but they're not solving the long-term problem because we all don't want to live under China. Believe me, I've been in a Chinese jail. You don't want to be in China, and dissent or do something that they don't think is good. Because, whatever, it's not a good situation. So anyhow, there's a kind of a way. So anyhow, that's the bigger picture thing. And so, but I would say it's not the things you're thinking about. We have technology, capital, ingenuity, all that stuff. But we have to get these essentially what are social, societal, civilizational innovation going. And I don't know, it sounds like you all are business folks, and that's awesome because there's a ton of things we need to do in business and technology and scaling in that world. And that's the loosest and most fertile place right now. But the really hard problems are going to be these other level things, and we'll solve them. But that's the tough ones. Maybe that's a long answer, but
thank you
that's
so
where
much.
we're at.
Well, Peter, so if you think about Western Europe and the Nordics, what's your advice for companies or CEOs regarding, they both need to think about the environment, and they also need to think about, having profitable companies. So what's your advice to CEOs of the companies or people working as business people in Western Europe?
Well, now I don't know. Again, I don't have deep expertise in what's literally going on, but my understanding is, for example, you guys, deeply rooted in carbon energy extraction and, sovereign wealth coming off that, but also really ahead of the curve on, transition to electric mobility and electric cars and all that kind of stuff. So I'm not sure exactly what choices are happening exactly. So I'm seeing but they seem correlated and positive in a way. So I would just say, the one thing I would just say is, there's no doubt in my mind, we are in a world historic period now, 30-year period, I would say. That's why the thing is we have to scale our efforts to climate change on a level that nobody's really fully thinking through or embracing. And I shouldn't say nobody, but I'm just saying the general thing is we're all kind of lagging, thinking, well, okay, now we're starting to get around to it and it'll eventually happen. And okay, yeah. But I think it's going to come increasingly clear that it's just going to break this decade, for example. It's just going to be a lot of shit's going to happen all over the place in terms of climate. We've had wildfires here that are just atrocious. We're watching what happened in Texas today. You guys have your versions up there. I don't know the latest stuff. Have you been watching this stuff? It's like what do they call it? The currents of the North Atlantic are essentially starting to shift off the drainage off of Norway, off of Greenland. If that shifts lower, you guys are going into cold times, Anyhow, the point is we're in a thing now that is just not turn around. By the way, if you want to have a really interesting little Kim Stanley Robbins's latest, he's a science fiction writer. His latest book is called The Ministry of the Future. If you guys haven't heard about it or thought about it, anyhow, it's a fantastic near-term sci-fi thing, but he's always rooted his sci-fi in realistic technologies. He's never gone to warp speed to wherever. It's near-term technologies, and he's really looking at the next 30 to 50 years about how the hell we could realistically solve climate change. By the way, it's centered in Europe, and it's also used in the United Nations. Actually, out of Switzerland is a key place there. Anyhow, the point being, though, you look at this thing and you start realizing, oh my God, we're going to have to probably get into some. He's made me think differently about geoengineering, for example, how we might have to do some serious geoengineering on this stuff. Anyhow, the point being is what I would just do is, even if you guys are tuned into climate change, and even if it's something you're worried about, and even if it's something you think is on your thing, just go deeper in that world and really understand what's really happening in that space, and understand what's going to happen to get to solve this, and then to step up as high and as best you can to go as far into helping solve that problem for any business. It's going to pay dividends, because it's only going to get crazier in the next decade here. I showed you the demographics and stuff. It's all the next level customers, all the next level workers, all this is just, they're all steep in this. They're all in lockstep about what's going on here. And and particularly if you're rooted in oil, and I don't want to be rude here, but I would just say, you want to do everything you can to make up for what is going to get potentially some crazy politics around people super mad and super angry about what the developed world, and particularly oil-based developed world, did to the planet and didn't do to help solve the thing. Again, I'm not normally a positive guy, but I'm a positive guy normally, and so I don't want to kind of push the fear thing in there, but I think it could get really bad, actually. I think, and in this sci-fi thing, which again is near-term sci-fi, he's great. I've read probably half a dozen, if a dozen, anyhow, a ton of his books. He's always good like this. He's not the greatest writer, by the way. It's not going to be like drama of like the internal mind of the characters. But he basically comes out and says it's going to be one of the things that's going to shift the politics is going to be almost like terrorism against those most responsible for this. That kind of dramatically shift the politics of the world. Now, I don't know if it'll get to that, but I'm just saying it's worth reading and contemplating it. And I think because of that, if you're coming from where you're coming, or if you're in a company that's been rooted in that, or whatever, is you got to really think that through and think, okay, what is the most I can possibly do and still be profitable, still make money, still kind of whatever, and just be generous, step up. And I think the whole West, since we really did get the world in this problem, honestly, over the last 200 years, we got to step up too in a way that we're not. And the U.S. is like someone was mentioned Trump. I mean, of course, we've had Trump of all freaking people. What an embarrassment and what a kind of crazy thing. But I will just tell you, that was the last gasp of that old era, and I will promise you that isn't coming back. Just like the 30s, we're in a very similar situation to the 30s. The 30s were essentially, we were on a cusp of a different era, and there were dramatic stakes at that time. And we are in dramatic stakes this time. So for example, I'll just tell you, the reason you're seeing this battle in the United States go right now around politics, when you really go deeper, it's essentially a battle around energy at some level. The red states are rooted in carbon energies, and they know that it's a fight to the death on that level. And there's a ton of livelihood, and there's a way of life, and there's everything there. And the blue states are in kind of clean energy at some level. And it's not that crazy to talk about this as almost more like a civil war kind of level thing. And it's not literally in the streets, although we're starting to get right-wing guys with guns, and anyhow, it's getting there. But think about what the American Civil War in the 19th century was, essentially a similar existential economic civil war around a slave-based economy and a manufacturing-based or free labor-based economy. And that was the real fight there. Yet it was emancipating human beings from slavery. That was a big driver for sure. But really what was happening was we could not have gone any further. There were two competing fundamentally different systems, and we had a civil war over it. And we resolved it. Slavery was done. We're going into the kind of free labor manufacturing world. And it worked for us. And we eventually, got it. I don't want to overstate it, but I'm saying that's the prism I would put on this. And I would say you should think about it at that level, which is in the lens of history, we're at a moment where there's an old system we got to get off. It's not quite as bad as slavery, but it's going to be seen as screwing up the planet for everybody. And then there's a system that could save us and move us on and take us into the future, the long-term and sustainable way. That's the juncture we're in. Double down, look at it big picture, think about what your kid, that Gen Zer, is going to think about in 2100, and do the right thing. That's what I would do right now, and do everything you could possibly do, basically, for that. Without being too dramatic, that's one way to think about it. And
very good. So I know, Stephen, you need to go in 2 or 3 minutes. But do you have a short summing up thing, Stephen, or a question for Peter? And also, Peter, there are 2 more questions here. I don't know if you have the time to answer them quickly, but
I could answer them quickly. Go on, sure.
But Stephen,
Peter, I can stay until we're done. But Peter, one question would be, maybe thinking about the black swans or the pandemic, but do you see the pandemic, for instance, actually accelerating the trends which you identified the inexorables, or do you see absolutely? I'll tell you what. Do you see it
I've been saying the pandemic has been the best thing that ever could have happened to us. I mean, it's not downplaying, 500,000 people have died in the United States here, or whatever, 2 million globally, all that. It's not saying that. I'm saying the pandemic was an incredibly fortuitous wake-up call that has reset the dial for everybody on all kinds of things. And it's certainly happening in politics in this country. I think it's an opportunity all over the world for this. I think it's gotten us geared around how do you respond quickly to global crises, in this case, the pandemic. I mean, it's amazing how the scientific community was connected up and solved this and got this vaccine out as fast as it did. It's also amazing how we were able to kind of abandon old economic policies and sustain, workers in different ways. And anyhow, a million things that are good about this. It also just shook us up that, we can't just keep doing the same things, like out of left field. These things can happen and we got to think differently. Anyhow, I think it's been a great thing. I will say, one thing that you should all think about, and I use this actually in my piece, is, but I say, we are so lucky the pandemic hit in 2020, because if it would have been just 20 years ago, if it would have hit, we would have been probably not much better than we were in 1918 with the Spanish flu, or I don't know what you guys call it. We call it the Spanish flu, whatever the global pandemic in the world is talking about. Anyhow, and here's why. It's like, if we would have gone 20 years ago, as I mentioned, look at the numbers. I mean, it was a handful of Americans, like 50 million Americans, yes, and some elite Europeans, but basically we couldn't, the entire 250 million knowledge workers around the planet couldn't have just gone to their homes on their high bandwidth, high computerized things, start doing Zoom and just start innovating and keep going on with that. You couldn't have had all the kids, all the school kids in many places of the developed world just going to school through the video. Anyhow, nothing would have happened. I mean, it would have been completely different. That's one thing. Second thing is we still hadn't cracked the first human genome. It was a $2 billion project. It only kind of really came to fruition in 2002. So in 2000, we didn't even know how to crack a genome, let alone on top of the the kind of mutating virus day by day by day by day. We're just sequencing that thing all over, and we got all the differentiations and all the genomes, and we understand what's different and why it went, and we can trace it. Anyhow, none of that would happen. That was 20
an mRNA vaccine. I mean, it used to take years to make a vaccine.
Exactly. We wouldn't have, it would have taken 40 years to do. See, that's the second thing. And the third thing, which is interesting from the rebuild, from the climate change thing, is all the alternatives. So the economy crashes and the oil just goes down, crashes, as we know. we wouldn't have had this renewable energy to build off of. We would have had to rebuild back in carbon energy again, because solar was way too expensive and all that kind of stuff. Electric batteries were way too expensive. We couldn't have done electric cars. Anyhow, so 20 years later, it's like, wow, we don't have to go back to oil or even natural gas. We can freaking go to, solar and electric cars. Anyhow, the point is 20 years of innovation, folks, just 20 years of innovation have changed the fundamental stakes of what we're doing in the world right now. And it's, so what's the next 20 years going to do, or the next 40 years going to do? And so this is what I'm thinking. It's a different mindset of how fundamentally the world can change around innovation in such a short time, and why the importance of innovation to everything we do, basically. But certainly in business and technology, but also, I'm saying, social innovation. We got to start now moving up the food chain into democracy, global governance, that kind of stuff. Anyhow, that's a long way of saying it, but it's quite astounding when you step back and think about it. It's like, we're lucky we got hit now.
That's
But
right.
frankly, in 10 years, we'll probably take it in stride. It'll be, oh, another pandemic. Okay, well, let's crank out the vaccines again or whatever. I don't know. Anyhow, you said there was a couple questions or something, last questions, or?
Yeah, go ahead and take a couple more.
Yes,
if
yes,
you
there are
have
two
time.
more if you have the time, Peter.
Yeah, I can do a little bit more here.
And Stephen, if you need to go, I understand. So, Peter Sinaro, go ahead, please.
Yes. Hi, Peter. You were talking about reinventing the democracy, and that put me in the idea of Europe, the Western world, and everything. Maybe we are a little bit too over-regulated in our democracies. But then again, we have this very nice article in the part of our curriculum in this school, which is called "Building a Digital Ready Culture in Traditional Organization," written by George Westerman. And it's basically that traditional companies look at technology-born companies and take the best things out of them, and in the combination, that's builds really great things. And my question is, how do we actually combine that not on a micro level, on an organizational level, but on a macro level? How can we do that in the Western world? How can we combine the great things about in our societies and still be, take up the competition with Asia, China, and so on, towards being more innovative and more agile and so on? Because we don't really want to be China. We would still want to have unions and employee rights and all those things, and still be, beat them in the tech and innovative game. How do we do that?
Well, that's what I'm saying is there's a level of innovation in those spaces that I wasn't able to wrap my head around enough. Well, frankly, there's not enough thinking in that, and there's not enough new modeling, and there's not enough experimentation or a lot of stuff in that space yet. But what I've learned in just tracking the front lip of tech disruption, which I've done for 25 years, and watching how these things work, is they usually don't get dealt with until they become an obvious problem. And then what's great about it is you get the global hive mind of innovators start going into it. And I think this is one of the next frontiers. So like if you guys look like they're more mid-career or early career things, so maybe you're not the right crew, but if I were telling kids in college or something, I would say, maybe some of the most interesting frontiers would be social, innovation around democracies or global governance or, systems, modeling system change at a civilizational level or whatever. I don't know, there's a lot of stuff there. I just don't think there's not a lot of work because we're kind of coming off a period where it was much more focused on the fundamental technologies, fundamental business practices, which is businesses always move fast. They always go fast. We're in that. We're kind of watching the cresting of a good run of that, and then we're moving into another run of that. This is why I say it's long boom squared. There's going to be that again squared, but then we're also bringing into account this next level of innovation that frankly we had very little of. In fact, we had no innovation. We had basically no governmental or very little governmental democracy innovation. Someone could argue with me. I would love to hear it. But anyhow, we kind of didn't touch that stuff. In fact, we just kind of denigrated it and let it go ahead. And that's why it's atrophied and it's just not working. So anyhow, but that I think is going to change, and I think that's maybe one of the next frontiers. So going there. But anyhow, that I thought you were saying something different. I would say one thing which I thought you were saying, but it sounds like maybe not. Is there is a fun? So some of you might work for big companies. There is an actual interesting, it's kind of the Clay Christensen Innovators Dilemma thing, which is to what extent can large established legacy companies innovate at the way that a startup can? And I think that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure the answer to that. One of the weird things, I've been hired as a senior fellow for strategic foresight for Autodesk, not a full-time thing, but a project I'm working on, is they're in that space. They're trying to figure out, they're a 40-year company. This is the, AutoCAD and all the different architects, construction, manufacturing, and how you do that software. And they're trying to figure out, is there a way that we can innovate and push the edge of innovation, or are we only going to have to keep buying innovative startups, integrating the teams in it? And their aspiration is to prove Christensen wrong, but I'm watching it as a senior fellow thinking, I hope they can, because that's a critical thing, because it would be great if we could find better ways for kind of legacy industries to reinvent themselves more fundamentally. Because, for example, I was thinking about this is in terms of climate change. One of the reasons I'm doing this is Autodesk is a really interesting company, because if you're going to have to redesign the entire world to deal with climate change and essentially make sustainable everything, it's like they are in every one of the fields you want: architects, construction firms, manufacturing, things, manufacturing lines. And they're also in sci-fi, they do all the kind of, Star Trek movie stuff and things, because they're good at three-dimensional modeling. Anyhow, the point is you'd want them to scale, because basically everybody on the planet has to basically redesign everything at some level, if you think of that's the goal. So would you want a startup to start and take 10 years to grow it, to kind of build it to a unicorn, to then build a global sales force, to kind of whatever, take them 10 years just to get out of the gates, at some level? But they'd be on a new platform and it might be more, innovative and all that kind of stuff. Or would you rather find a way for the 40-year-old thing with people all over the world, 10,000 employees all over the world, to just keep going and push this thing all over the planet, because we don't have time to waste? Boom, you guys are best positioned, solve it. Anyhow, it's an interesting dilemma. I don't know the answer to it. I've just started for a month here looking at it, and I'm trying to figure that out. It's like, but if they can do it, then others can do it anyhow. It's an interesting experiment, but that is a key thing to think about. And maybe your generation has got to figure that out, because we don't want to start over everything. We don't want to have to destroy the old legacy every time and start a new thing. We want to figure out, how do we get legacy things to be innovative?
Well,
I don't know the answer to that.
my question was that, there's a lot of theory and ideas how you can scale, or you can reinvent your traditional company to be more agile and more future looking. So my question was, how do you do that on the country level? Because I think I see that as almost the same problem.
They're kind of related problems. How do you take a kind of a legacy government democracy and reinvent it?
Yeah,
they're both. I don't know the answer to that. Maybe you can figure that out, and I'd love to hear that story. Anyhow, I'm working on that one next.
Okay, very good. So, Stephen, I'll let you wrap up, and I just after the wrap up, I'll turn over to a very short summary in Norwegian, like a 5-minute thing. But go ahead, Stephen. Your wrap up thing is now, please.
Well, Peter Leyden, thank you so much for joining us. This has been absolutely fantastic. We really appreciate your challenging the students. Part of this program is about getting them exposed to new ideas, to big picture thinking, to asking the challenging questions about how they can transform their companies, their careers, their country, their society. So this has been just really, truly fantastic. Thanks for broadening our horizons across all facets of technology and polity and society. On behalf of the students, we thank you, and we hope that you'll consider joining us again, perhaps in person in the future. Next time.
Yeah, come next time. Next year when you guys come, we can have beers afterwards and debate these till the wee hours of the night. But anyhow, it's been fun seeing you folks and talking about it, and and appreciate it. Spread the word, and check out the pieces in Medium, and send that email around, or that video around to anyone you want. It's like, let's get people thinking bigger picture, more positive and more transformative, because we need to do it starting now. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Our pleasure, Peter. Well, and we will send that around to all the students after this program. So with that, Peter, thank you so much. And to the students, we'll see you tomorrow.
Yeah, see you guys.
See you tomorrow. Okay. Ja, jeg tenker bare skulle runde kort av. Det har vært en dag med mange nye ideer, får jeg håpe, nye perspektiver. Så det kort, hvis jeg kan bruke 5 minutter bare, og så starter vi I morgen igjen 11:45. Jeg skulle bare få lov å trekke frem veldig kort det vi har hørt I dag, og hva har det å gjøre så å si med det som målforsamlingen og emneoversikten. Så det noe med da å bli kjent med hvordan innovasjon og kommersialisering utføres I noen av de beste bedriftene I USA. Jeg har fått eksempler her fra Steven Issel og Jim Sporer, og også nå Peter Leiden. Det har jo til en viss grad noen overlappende tema. Dette her med nederste bulletpunktet her, å få en økt forståelse av hvordan ny teknologi kan anvendes, først da I amerikanske bedrifter, og så hvordan vi kan prøve å tenke hvordan dette kan anvendes I egne bedrifter, kommuner og organisasjoner. Vi har hørt litt om Silicon Valley som et av de mest innovative stedene I verden, men vi har jo også fått høre om Kina, og litt om Europa, og hvordan Silicon Valley blir utfordret av kreftene I Kina, og hvor mye penger de bruker på det. Innovasjon I praksis I amerikanske bedrifter vi jo innom I en del av disse presentasjonene. Rosalind var også innom dette med åpen innovasjon og lukket innovasjon. Snakket om det, at Kina som et eksempel på lukket innovasjon, som har suksess. Vi har også vært innom litt om teknologistrategi I digitale forretningsmodeller, men I hvert fall teknologi, at det å få høre Peter Leiden og hans tenkning flere 10 år frem I tid, synes jeg interessant. Det med det som Trond Petersen snakket om fra Berkeley, har jo å gjøre med I hvert fall en bakgrunn for innovasjonssystemer, og hvor viktig Stanford-universitetet og Berkeley-universitetet har vært. Kommersialiseringsperspektivet har ikke vært så sterkt fremme. Jeg regner vi får høre noe mer om det, for eksempel ved Laila Danielsen sin presentasjon fredag morgen klokken 9, når hun presenterer Elliptic Labs. Sosiale nettverk har vært nevnt av blant annet Trond Petersen og også Jim Sporer, med snakk om viktigheten av det som foregår I Silicon Valley og det sosiale aspektet. Og så det da på en måte et underliggende tema her om digitale strategier for å øke verdiskapingen og hvordan digitaliseringen kan gjøre det. Så jeg føler at vi har vært innom en del av disse emnene. Det vil jo fortsette også å bli behandlet fremover. Så har vi også da disse 10 spørsmålene, ikke sant? Og vi hører jo hvordan de jobber for å få innovasjon sentralt I bedriftene, og hvor viktig det for den økonomiske utviklingen av USA, California, Silicon Valley. Steven nevnte dobbeltmodellen, det var kanskje mer I forbifarten, men dette temaet her da, om hvordan digitalisering og plattformer kan skape verdi, har jo vært belyst, og jeg synes jo Jim Sporers presentasjon om teknologi og serviceinnovasjon på en interessant perspektiv. Så hører vi også da om nye digitale teknologier. Så vi innom disse spørsmålene. Det var en av de som nevnte design thinking. Jeg husker ikke helt hvem det var I forbifarten, men Jim Sporer var jo helt klart inne på service innovation eller tjenesteinnovasjon I det han snakket om. Og jeg var litt opptatt av kulturaspektet, det får vi høre mer om I morgen med Tone Ringstad. Og ledelse av digital transformasjon jo et underliggende tematikk, så vi innom denne tematikken, så slik dere ser, så jeg vil bare nå på slutten av dagen bare oppsummere litt sånn kort og dra noen linjer fra det vi har hørt til det som da disse 10 sentrale spørsmålene og det som målene for denne samlingen. Ok. Jeg tror vi bare runder av her og nå, og jeg vil gjerne takke dere for mange spørsmål og gode innspill. Vi starter opp I morgen 11:45. Jeg skal sende en liten oversikt over hvilke artikler vi får gått gjennom, eller dere går gjennom fra 12 til 12:45. Og ellers så følger vi programmet som det står fremover for morgendagen. Så det må jeg si frem til det. Og denne dagen en sånn typisk dag på denne modul 4, og sånn vil morgendagen og fredagen også være. Ok, så da får vi bare runde av opptaket. Takk til deg, Bendik, som har vært med I dag og gjort veldig mye bak kulissen her for å få det til å fungere bra. Jeg må si at jeg litt imponert over Zoom-løsningen når vi har med folk altså fra Washington DC og København og San Francisco, og det teknisk har det fungert helt supert, synes jeg. Så jeg håper utbyttet har vært brukbart. Så da sier jeg takk for I dag, ses I morgen 11:45.